Grazie. Ma allora io volevo essere presente almeno un momento di questa importante edizione di Concetto Festa, che ormai è diventato un appuntamento irrinunciabile per la nostra città. Vi ringrazio innanzitutto la Fondazione Levin e tutti gli altri, anche il gruppo di soggetti che hanno partecipato a pensare questo evento a livello nazionale e per gli ospiti di questi giorni della nostra città a livello internazionale. Vi voglio ricordare che alle origini di 900 Feste fu un evento, un convegno, un'iniziativa che partiva dalla volontà di affermare il fatto che Forlì non è la città delle luci. La presenza di l'ubicazione storica, la sua storia, la vicinanza a Prima fece Mussolini di Forlì la sua piazza dove intendeva allargare certamente simbolicamente la sua azione e la sua crescita e quindi di sottolineare le radici dell'esperienza del regime fascista. Forlì quindi ha dovuto fare i conti nel secondo Novecento soprattutto con questa eredità e non è stato mai facile affrontarlo, è sempre stato più facile tenere nascosto, ma tenere nascosto significa anche affrontare il rischio di un degrado della fisicità degli spazi, degli ambienti, ma anche quello poi della eredità della memoria. E allora in questi anni saper riscoprire con senso critico e rileggere quegli anni della democrazia è un antidoto ad affrontare con correttezza il tema dei regimi totalitari negli anni attuali. E quindi chi ha immaginato questo momento, il Festival del Novecento, 900 Festa, e ogni anno darci gli elementi di una riflessione approfondita con autorevoli relatori, oggi rende un servizio pubblico, un servizio civile alla esistenza di una consapevolezza comune su quello che devono essere le guide poi delle tante azioni invece in cui si ribadisce l'importanza della democrazia. Oggi pomeriggio in questa piazza si terrà un evento che con i migranti della nostra città, con le persone straniere, che vuole affermare il fatto che Forlì è una città aperta nella sostanza e aperta anche mentalmente. E in un evento come 900 Feste quest'anno, che prende spunto proprio dalle leggi razziali del 1938 e vuole affermare quale sia stata la tragedia e anche accettare passivamente queste leggi hanno comportato, oggi si deve assolutamente mettere in condizioni di affrontare con consapevolezza, preoccupazione ma anche speranza gli anni a venire. E quindi io sono davvero contento di poter come città continuare a essere una delle capitali anche del pensiero antifascista, del pensiero aperto e democratico, e un evento come 900 Fest è sicuramente un fecondo per alimentare elementi e creare una buona relazione tra le persone. Forlì è orgogliosa. Grazie e buon lavoro.
Buongiorno, noi cominciamo questa giornata dedicata a cosmopolitismo e comunità e cominciamo con stamani con tre relatori che poi vi presenterò un po' meglio, ma non molto bene probabilmente, Michel, Wieviorka, Giorgi Cooper e Wolfgang Merkel. Il tema appunto è cosmopolitismo e comunità. Vorrei dire solo due cose, 2 minuti, su questo tema che è un tema che è molto dibattuto fuori Italia, pochissimo dibattuto in Italia. Questo nesso, anche la contraddizione e anche le antinomie della questione cruciale oggi. Prima il sindaco parlava degli immigrati. Il tema cruciale è il rapporto tra i diritti civili e i diritti umani, tra il concetto di cittadinanza e il concetto dell'umanità. E se voi ascoltate un po' i politici, anche quelli che sono oggi al potere in Italia, usano molto la parola cittadino e spesso non riflettiamo su che cosa significa la parola cittadino nella loro bocca, ma non solo nella loro bocca, in genere anche in teoria, fin dalla rivoluzione francese. C'è una contraddizione nella stessa rivoluzione francese tra i diritti del cittadino, che sono del cittadino, e i diritti umani, che sono anche di chi non è il cittadino. Allora, la parola, la categoria cittadino può essere anche usata per escludere qualcun altro, non solo per includere tutti quelli che sono cittadini, ma per escludere coloro che non sono cittadini. Come dicevo, questo è un tema molto dibattuto oggi altrove, molto poco in Italia, tranne qualche eccezione, ma anche un tema che riporta la comunità, e qui poi mi taccio, e che riguarda il modo di vivere e di convivere di chi è arrivato qui dentro le nostre città, cioè i ghetti degli immigrati, il rapporto tra le loro leggi interne alle comunità e lo Stato, soprattutto in Gran Bretagna, e cose simili. E anche ovviamente, e qui credo che in particolare ne parleremo dopo, Giudico ne parlerà, è anche un problema del rapporto tra il territorio e il cittadino, cioè fin dove la cittadinanza deve corrispondere al territorio e il territorio alla cittadinanza, un tema dibattuto soprattutto nel pensiero politico ebraico della fine dell'Ottocento e del Novecento, e che in Israele ora è molto dibattuto, molto combattuto. Io credo che parleremo di questo, anche delle forme di autonomia, insomma, delle comunità che sono composte da immigrati. Questo e poi il tema generale della democrazia, che è un tema fondamentale e esplosivo oggi, in un'epoca in cui viene a mancare il nesso che davamo per scontato tra democrazia, benessere e progresso. No? Tutto questo oggi è pesantemente messo in questione anche per colpa delle disuguaglianze. Io spero che parleremo un po' di questo e che porteremo un po' di vento appunto abbastanza innovativo rispetto alla discussione italiana. E cominciamo con Michel Wieviorka, che è un sociologo francese molto famoso in Francia, non solo in Francia, è uno dei pionieri della sociologia di questi ultimi, proprio della ricerca sulle democrazie, sulle crisi delle democrazie. Ha lavorato moltissimo sulle questioni di transizione dei paesi dell'est, ha lavorato tantissimo sulle questioni polacche, su Sovranità, c'è stato anche non solo come sociologo ma anche come militante, se non sbaglio rispetto a Solidarność. E oggi il presidente della fondazione di Maison de Sciences a Parigi, che è una fondazione fondata da Brodel, e lui ci parlerà di Ferdinand Brodel, ci parlerà di democrazia, crisi, metamorfosi.
Grazie Wlodek. Signor Sindaco, perdona, non parlo italiano, allora parlo francese, ma più facile se parlo inglese, mi ha detto il traduttore. Allora, I will speak in English, excuse me. It's not your language, it's not my language, but it's easy. So, tomorrow in near the city there will be a march with some, what is the Italian name for these people, nostalgic. Tomorrow there will be a vote in Brazil, and I am almost sure that an extreme right president will be elected. So it's a good moment for us to think about democracy, when democracy produces also this possibility of having extreme right, fascist votes. When I prepared my talk, I was thinking that 60 or 70 years ago, things were totally different. Nobody would have organized this kind of meeting, and nobody would have organized a meeting discussing the very idea of democracy. At that time, we had some dissidents in the Soviet Union that did not accept totalitarianism. A little bit later, you had some movements, the more important one, thank you, Wlodek, was in Poland, Solidarity. And at the same time, in the 70s, before Solidarity, we had dictatorships in many countries, in Latin America. And maybe we all forget that the end of dictatorship in Europe was only in the mid-70s, when we see the collapse of Franco, Salazar, the Greek colonists, and so on. So we are not so far from these times. Why do I say that? Because when you are facing totalitarianism, dictatorship, maybe you don't have so much to discuss what is democracy. Democracy was obvious for those that believed in it. So it was not something which was really discussed in political philosophy, for instance. Not so much. And many people say, well, Churchill is right. There is a very famous sentence by Churchill saying something like, I don't quote exactly, but something like, democracy is the worst kind of government except all others. Something like that. And people say, this is democracy. So in the 60s, the 70s, people did not so much discuss seriously democracy as such, per se. It's only in the 80s, I think, and in the 90s that it began to become a real important issue to be discussed. Maybe the starting point, or one of the starting point, is a very famous statement by an American political philosopher, Francis Fukuyama, in 1989. This political philosopher said something like, with the collapse of the wall in Berlin, we enter in an era where there is only democracy and market. There is no other future for mankind than democracy and market. He published a very famous book, The End of History, explaining this idea, which means we don't have to discuss democracy. And at that moment, people began to discuss democracy because there were some problems, there were some limits, there were some difficulties. And we did not have to say only democracy is the contrary of totalitarianism, democracy is the contrary of dictatorship. No, we have to discuss what it has to be, what it can bring, and what are the limits of democracy. So this is what I would like to present this morning, taking 4 or 5 important issues connected with this idea of limits or difficulty for democracy. The first point, which began to be very visible in the 80s and in the 90s, is economy, democracy and economy, democracy and employment. During the Cold War, which is not so far from us, countries like France, Italy, and many others were, during 30 years, 35 years, living a moment, an historical moment, when there was no problem, or not so many problems, with employment and with growth. The French call, the 30 years after the Second World War, we call it in France post-industrial societies, we entered in a also where unemployment appeared, growth began not to be so high, and many social issues happened. At the same time, during the 80s and more in the 90s, we discovered that economy, we have to think it as a world level, since solutions to the problems that are arising because of this globalization of the economy has to be prepared at the national level. And it was not easy for democracy to discuss this important issue. And so in many countries, we discover riots, we discover issues connected with migrants, we discover difficulties also to face social inequalities, many problems that made, for instance, in the 90s and until now, that in such countries that belong to the former Soviet empire, some people have a lot of nostalgia. Not all people, but some people, because they say in the past we had employment, the people had not had a high level of salary, but we had full employment. We did not have problems for lodging. We could send our children to school and so on and so on. Today it's more difficult. So the idea that economy is a problem and that democracy as a national level of country, nation states, democracy is not so able to face these issues. So you have frustrations, resentment, people that, not necessarily because they are poor, but because that has a feeling that there is no future, that life will be more and more difficult, and so on. So the first point is democracy is not perfectly able to deal with economic issues. That's my first point. My second point is much more connected with the core of this meeting, democracy and minorities. Democracy, the French don't use so much about minorities. Democracy and people that are different, to say it a little bit different. When we discuss democracy, in general, we consider that democracy is liberal and that it is made for individuals that have rights, duties, and individuals that are more or less recognized as such. In all constitutions, there are wonderful sentences saying that. But what do we do with collective identities, minorities, groups, when they are defined by religion, where they are defined by their origin or whatever? Here come two categories of problems, not only one. The first kind of problem is one group connected with a territory who wants independence for this territory. Catalonia, take a very important recent case. Scotland, another recent important case in our part of the world, but there are other issues like that in other parts of the world. At the same moment, when Catalonia was having a referendum, a forbidden referendum, to know if they want to have or not independence, exactly at the same moment, there was the same kind of referendum in the Iraqi Kurdistan. We want independence. So it's not only in this part of the world. So for democracy, it's difficult to organize a debate on these issues because a nation state never likes to lose some territories. It's to lose one part of the world. So democracy are not so good in order to organize debate and to find solutions when people say we want our territory to be independent. Cameroon did not so bad with Scotland, but as we all know, in Catalonia things are not solved and democratic measures are not so easy to implement. But this is not the more interesting case. The more interesting case is the second kind of issues, which are connected with the fact that in societies you always have minorities, groups, communities, you can give different names, that want recognition, to use the word Taylor, a great Canadian philosopher, recognition, which means that these minorities want to appear as such in the public sphere and not only in the private life. And here begin debates. What do you do in a country when a minority says, we want to exist, we want to be recognized as such, we want to have collective rights for the minority? These are big debates that began, from my point of view, in the late 60s in Canada. There was a very famous report, an official report, which was asked by a political power in order to deal with the Québécois issue, the francophone issue, if you like more, because as you know, in Canada, you have one part of the country which speaks French and which people call francophone. And the report, it was very interesting. The report said, we are asked to give a solution or to analyze a big linguistic and big cultural issue, but it's not that, it's a multi-cultural issue. Because in Canada you have the francophone, you have the anglophones, but you also have natives, Indians, you also have other categories of migrants. You have an history made of Ukrainians or German people coming to Canada in the past that don't appear, that are not recognized as. So they said, let us speak of multiculturalism and not only of two cultures, which was also a perverse message to the francophone, because it meant if you want independence for you, because you are a minority in Canada, then don't forget, you will have to discuss with minorities within Quebec. You will have to discuss with Indians. You will have to discuss with new migrants and so on. What will you do? So, for me, it's a moment when the debate began. And as Michael Wolfgang, the philosopher, the American philosopher, is part of the committee that organizes, the scientific committee that organizes our meeting today, let me quote. During 20 years or 30 years, there were debates between two categories of political actors, intellectuals, philosophers, and so on, in order to know, do you want to be a comunitarian, that is to say, to promote recognition for minorities, or do you want to be liberal, which promotes the idea of individuals being recognized in the public sphere? And it was a terrible war between, a terrible intellectual war between the two possibilities. And one day, this is where I quote Michael Wolfgang, one day Michael Wolfgang said, I'm fed up with this. There is nothing new 30 years after all this debate began. There is nothing new. So he said, when I am with people that promote communitarianist ideas, I take the opposite perspective and the reverse when I am the. So that is to say, we have finished with proposing new ideas in this debate, and it has not been that we solve it, but there is nothing new today in this debate out of the opposition of the two perspectives. And well, it's, I think, like that. So, in different countries, the debate was sometimes different. For instance, in my country, in France, a French writer, which was well-known, Régis Debray, said, we have to choose, either we are Républicain, either we are Democrat. But it was exactly the same idea. Républicain, the French vocabulary, meant liberal, and Democrat meant communitarist, to say it. What is important here in this debate is that, in fact, you have to know that there is not one problem, but two. Of course, the more obvious point, the more obvious problem is that recognition of communities, minorities, may lead to awful things. Community obliging individuals to obey, and first of all, women. So it may lead to sectarianism, closing of the group, and so on. So it can be very dangerous on the one. But promoting universalism that deals only with individuals can lead also to big problems. What Karl Marx used to call abstract universalism that does not recognize that we all have roots, we all have origins, we all belong to some minorities, sometimes at least. So what do we do if we want to avoid the two dangers, and not only one danger? Communitarism, excesses of communitarism, but also excesses of abstract universalism. This is a key theoretical, but also political and practical issue. I would like now to deal with a third example that shows that democracy cannot solve everything just like that. The third point is connected with the idea of limits of the so-called political representation, representative democracy. That is to say, democracy being organized with political parties. I'm obliged to be simple because these are very complex issues. So, is it possible not to deal with political parties but still be democratic? This is a big idea. Maybe Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the first ones that discussed this idea. And here there are a certain number of proposals that try to take into account the fact that today political systems and classical political parties everywhere in the world have big difficulties. These difficulties are clear. When political parties are not able to act correctly, then you have extreme forces, and we all know that it is the case today. I don't discuss this too much. We have political abstention. People don't vote, but not for the same reasons than in the past. In the past, many people did not vote because they were not educated people. So they did not know that they could vote. Today, many people don't vote because they consider that the political offer does not give satisfaction. So it's something different, and this opens the way to debate: should vote be compulsory, obligatory, which is a very important issue. The third point connected with this is the idea of post-democracy, which was, for instance, introduced by Colin Crouch, a British political scientist. That is to say, okay, no problem with freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, and so on, but political life is not important for all citizens. It's a problem for some journalists, some politicians, some experts, some people that make surveys, political polls, and so on. And that's it, but it's not a big issue for many people. Political life is far from it. And what I would like to add here is that sometimes there is some renewal in the political parties, but this means that there is a renewal in the very society. A very interesting case, whatever you think about it, is the Spanish case with Podemos. If there is a new political force, it's because there was a social movement, a social and cultural movement, and M15. The French call this movement indignadas, the Spanish word, but they call themselves M15. So you could have a political new force appearing when you had some changes in the society. But out of this, what appears is much more extreme and populist and actors that are in favor of authoritarian. So, of course, some people try to promote new ideas for democracy, taking into account this crisis of classical representation. So I don't want to enter here in the debates about participating or deliberative democracy. Brazil here was a good example. It's in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, that we had the first important budget which was given budget, of the local budget was given to the people in the city, and this is very famous, was the beginning of the so-called participative democracy. But this exists. Some people also say we want direct democracy. We don't need parties. We don't need any mediation between the people and the political power. But this is the first one, participative or deliberative democracy, cannot face all the big issues that we have to face. And the direct democracy, from my point of view, can be very dangerous. We've seen it with Brexit. Brexit is a very good example of bad results of direct democracy. That is to say, a referendum that brings the country to a catastrophe. I want to deal now with another issue. I will do it very briefly, but it's a key issue. If you look at Italy today, or Brazil tomorrow, very tomorrow, there's something which is terrible. People have chosen the political force that will be ruling the country. They have been, the new powers are elected. So democracy is producing this power. It's not a coup, it's not the military that takes the power during one night. No, it's elections. People have chosen. The media have been able to promote debates. And so what do we do, to say very briefly, when democracy leads to a non-democratic power? It's a big, big issue. I have no solution, but I think we must absolutely discuss this, because this is what is happening more and more in the world. People vote. They are not victims of some crazy dictatorship. They choose. Now I would like to introduce another debate, just to give a more general idea of what are the problems for democracy, which is the problem of what Montesquieu, I don't know the English expression, called la séparation des pouvoirs, separating the justice, the parliament, and the executive power. Democracy sometimes faces big challenges, so big challenges that the political power will say something like, if we want democracy to be safe, we must use non-democratic devices. Sometimes the challenges are real challenges. Sometimes there is a kind of feeling of insecurity, a feeling of danger, and the political power will manipulate, will use this feeling, even if the danger is not so real. Of course, because political powers like to build enemies. We had a wonderful example yesterday with the Jews in the political discourse. Also, we've seen a movie where we could see Mussolini in Trieste explaining that maybe we could not accept some danger related to Jews. So, I think it's very important to know that democratic regimes can use non-democratic devices in order to protect the future of democracy, even if it is not sure that there is a real danger. So, of course, this is obvious when you have terrorism. In the United States, there is a famous law which is called Patriot Act that reduces the power of justice and the power of the parliament, because the executive power said we must be able to act very quickly without losing time with justice, without losing time with parliament and so on, in order to fight against terrorism. In my country, in France, it's the same. We have a certain number of measures that reduce the dissociation between justice, parliament, and executive power. So, what do we see when, in name of protecting democracy, the democratic power introduces non-democratic measures? We don't know so much what to do, and it's very difficult. I can tell you that those that say we don't want non-democratic measures are in a very, very bad situation. the day when there is a big terrorist attack, for instance. Because, you know, you did not want very quick and strong and maybe not so democratic measures that would have protected us. And now we have this attack and this terrible attention. So this is also a really important issue. So if I was finishing like that, I would have to tell you I am very pessimistic. The title of my paper is Crisis, Democracy, or Limits of Democracy, or Metamorphosis. So if I can have 5 minutes more, it's okay. I will just give you some reasons not to be totally pessimistic, to say that. My first idea, my main idea, is that democracy was mainly organized in countries at the level of the nation state. But that today, in the whole world, we can observe some new forms of democracy, either at a level higher than the nation state, either at a level lower than the nation state. And I will give you some examples to tell you that everything is not totally lost. On the one hand, maybe because we entered in an era which a good friend of mine, who was a wonderful sociologist and died 2 years ago, Ulrich Beck, a German sociologist, called cosmopolitization of the world. Not cosmopolitism, but cosmopolitization. His idea was that even a very local issue is understood by people as a global issue. We cannot live today without taking into account world dimensions of important issues. We are discussing Brazil today, and for instance, if you are a small Indian living, a small peasant living in the forest in Amazonia, and maybe some people are destroying your forest, maybe you will have a very local protest. But your local protest has a lot to do with these big companies that are destroying your forest, and also with all these NGOs that will maybe help you in the name of protecting climate, protecting environment at the world level. So a very limited issue has world dimension, and this is true for many other issues, of course. So when we are facing this globalization or cosmopolitization of the world, then we discover that limited but it exists forms of democracy exist at a level which is not only the level of the nation state. Let me give you a very few examples. Now, when we say United Nations, we should always say to all these NGOs that are protected or that can exist with the help of United Nations. And all these NGOs, not all of them, but many of them, have a very key role at the world level or at regional levels in order to protect rights of people, for example, to fight against violence, to promote human rights and so on. They are actors at the global level and not only at the level of the nation state. This is an example. Now, maybe I am not an expert, but in the past, people that are lawyers used to deal with international right. Today, we have more and more global right. Companies, big companies discuss with other big companies and with governments in order to promote a new world, which is not only the domination of economic forces, which is also a world with negotiation, agreements, new rules, new etc. It can have something connected with it. It could have something with democracy. So my first point here is that maybe at a higher level of the nation state, we are trying to find new forms of democracy. And here in Italy, we are in Europe. Of course, we all criticize the European Union. We all say that it is not enough connected with democracy, that it's a lot of bureaucracy, it's a lot of technocracy, and so on. And that is democracy at a higher level. So we could discuss this idea of some forms of democracy at a higher level. But now let us consider under the level of the nation state. I will give 2 or 3 examples. The family. In many families today, you have more democracy than in the past. Children exist. The wife exists. The family discusses. Every member of the family is the subject. It is not only the father who is the king and other people should absolutely do what the father decides. I don't say that it is everywhere like that, of course, but I think that this will work toward more democracy within the family is a strong goal. I would like to take another domain. It's the domain of, generally speaking, of institutions. You have more democracy within institutions. And this is why they cannot hide today what they used to hide in the past, that is to say, child abuse, violences to very young people, and many other awful things. Recently, maybe you noticed that the Prime Minister in Australia made a very, very important statement recognizing that it's time to finish with silence about all the awful things that have been committed within institutions toward children. And of course, I don't want to discuss this here, but you know, the Catholic Church today is opening debates which were impossible 20 or 30 years ago. Which means it's not only the pressure coming from outside, it's also that inside institutions are obliged to be a little bit more open to democracy than in the past. So, when I try to think about this level being under the state, or the level above the state, I can imagine that there are some possibilities to enter, that we are entering in a more democratic world than in the past. I don't say that we are in a world that we are, well, say, really less and less nationalism, less and less dictatorship, I don't know. But I also consider that everything is not so black, so sad. So we could introduce other aspects of this change, but it's time maybe to finish. Let us be not totally pessimistic. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Grazie anche al professore Wieviorka. Noi abbiamo pensato, qui se ancora i relatori sono d'accordo, che dopo Grazia si dà la parola al pubblico per 10 minuti, perché facciamo dopo ciascuna relazione un minimo di discussione, quindi siete invitati a parlare. I temi che ha sollevato il professor Wieviorka sono più o meno democrazia e economia, democrazia e comunità, democrazia e comunità, il problema dei partiti politici e quindi della rappresentanza e della disintermediazione che in Italia è fortissima ed è l'arma principale oggi dei partiti al potere oggi, e la separazione dei poteri, che anche questo è un tema in Italia fondamentale. Ci sono ministri che dicono che in fondo i banchieri perché devono parlare, i banchieri centrali se non sono stati eletti, e dal popolo, e infine la nota, diciamo, ottimistica sul fatto che la democrazia si sviluppa all'interno di altri ambiti rispetto allo Stato-Nazione, cioè che non c'è solo non è solo la cittadinanza o non cittadinanza che determina il nostro grado di partecipazione alla democrazia. Ok, se ci sono domande, commenti, contestazioni, siete la parola alla parola.
Prego, non so se c'è qualcuno che... Sì, prego.
Mi hanno dato un microfono qui, per cui rimango. Io vorrei sollevare sollevare un piccolo problema, che poi in realtà è enorme. Dall'impressione che ho, quando si parla di rappresentanza, spesso la si confonde con la delega. Il voto che viene espresso oggi, io ho esperienze soprattutto in Italia, è un voto di delega. Cosa vuol dire? Che si delega qualcuno ad agire per conto tuo. Secondo me il concetto di rappresentanza è un po' più ampio. Non è sufficiente delegare qualcuno il quale poi, come spesso succede in Italia, fa tutt'altre cose rispetto alle ragioni che ha propagandato. La Costituzione italiana prevede che non ci sia un mandato nella delega. È la ragione per cui frequentemente, sempre più frequentemente, fanno delle promesse durante la campagna elettorale per estorcere consenso e poi non le mantengono, o perché non sono in grado, o perché scelgono altre strade. Oppure altra cosa che succede, è successa con grande frequenza, persone elette in una formazione politica cambiano durante il Parlamento. Questo fatto comporta che in realtà chi viene eletto nei fatti non è rappresentante di nessuno, viene semplicemente delegato, non è vincolato a niente e quindi agisce poi non in nome di, ma sulla testa di tutti. Io credo che non aver risolto questo nesso fondamentale sia una delle ragioni principali della crisi della democrazia, per cui le democrazie stesse, agendo in un certo modo, stanno diventando non democrazie. Grazie.
Facciamo un'altra domanda e poi rispondere il professor Wieviorka.
Grazie. Prendo inizio da una frase di un patriota italiano dell'Ottocento, Massimo d'Azeglio. Massimo d'Azeglio, lo sappiamo dai nostri libri di scuola, disse: fatta l'Italia bisogna fare gli italiani. Gli italiani non esistevano e forse appunto bisognava inventare qualcosa per farli. Era un'impresa da far tremare i polsi, se si pensa a che cos'era l'Italia e a che cosa erano gli abitanti della penisola. Allora, pensiamo solo a un fenomeno come il brigantaggio. Tantissimi abitanti della penisola non volevano diventare italiani, eppure i patrioti dell'Ottocento in Italia pensavano che questo si potesse fare e in qualche modo ci sono riusciti. L'Italia oggi c'è con i suoi cittadini, i suoi simboli. E oggi, di fronte ai migranti che arrivano, non si tratta forse della stessa questione. Non è anche oggi che bisogna fare gli italiani. E perché ora questo problema sembra andare al di là delle nostre forze? Che visione abbiamo della nostra comunità se diamo per scontato che non possiamo riuscirci, che è impossibile? Grazie.
Ok, forse la parola al professor Wieviorka.
Well, thank you for opening this discussion. For the first point, first of all, sometimes it is better if some elected power does not do what he promised to do. If you listen to Bolsonaro in Brazil, let us hope he cannot do what he wants to do. Torture, kill, is to try to imagine other kinds of politics, other ways of doing politics, which is what some people do. I was quoting Podemos at the beginning. It was very interesting the way they were doing politics. Now, it's not so interesting, it's not so, but introducing new ways of acting. So it is true that the representative does what he wants or what she wants after being elected. Let me add also that in some countries, at least, the same person will be or not re-elected. Politicians sometimes spend a whole life in politics. So this is also an aspect of this issue, and let me so finish on this first point by a very general remark. We have to think on the possibility of having new ways of making policy. Maybe we must change institutions. So improving democracy is certainly also at the level of the nation state, not up or down, at this very level, in introducing new institutions, new manners of making politics. In my country, I will give you an example. In France, we have a very interesting debate because we are in the 5th Republic, and some people say we should pass to a 6th Republic number 6, a new constitution, in order to solve this kind of problems that have been put. Now, I have a second point about democracy and the nation, Italy and Italians. I think that when you have a community like Italy or France, we must have in mind that there are two different issues which are at stake. On the one hand, a country, a society, is a whole. There is unity. But on the other side, the country, the nation, is divided. You have different people, different groups, different social interests, and so on. So you have unity and diversity. Democracy, from my point of view, is not so much done in order to protect unity, which is protected much more by the idea of nation or state. Democracy is much more done in order to protect or to deal with diversity. What do we do with conflicting interest? What do we do with people that want to host migrants and people that don't want to host migrants and so on? So democracy, for me, is the capacity to debate in order to, excuse my awful vocabulary, sociological vocabulary, institutionalize conflicts, transform conflicts into debate and into negotiation and into possibilities to find solutions. This is for me the main point that democracy should achieve, and if democracy is not able to achieve this goal, that is to say, organize the life when you have diversity, then we have violence, then we have anti-systemic forces, then you have xenophobia, racism, and so on. So, it was very interesting yesterday, Mussolini, which I saw for the first time, Mussolini was speaking in name of uniting. But absolutely not in name of dealing with diversity. So democracy is dealing with diversity in order to avoid the worst. This will be my answer to your very important point, which means, and I finish with this point, which means that we must not say that we want to live in a world without conflict. We don't have to say that we want to live in post-conflict situations. No. We have to live in worlds with conflicts that can be institutionalized, that can be discussed. We cannot finish with conflict. We must take that seriously and organize a democratic way of dealing with them.
Grazie tante. Io prima di introdurre la professione del saggio École vorrei aggiungere una sola frase, approfitto del mio status, e a proposito della questione dei politici che non mantengono le promesse, vorrei semplicemente citare una frase che negli ultimi anni della sua vita molto spesso ripeteva Sigmund Bauman, ed era, lui diceva in questa fase della globalizzazione viviamo una situazione di divorzio tra potere e politica, e da qui discende il fatto che i politici possono promettere solo cose che sanno di non poter mantenere. C'è un po' questo, ma mi sembra che quello che ha detto il professor Wieviorka è anche un modo per dire, perché Roma non prevedeva le vie d'uscita da questo. Il professor Wieviorka un po' l'ha indicato, no? Della trasformazione appunto, della istituzionalizzazione del conflitto, della trasformazione della democrazia anche in senso positivo, non solo in senso populistico. Ok, allora Julie Cooper insegna a Tel Aviv, all'Università di Tel Aviv, insegna scienza politica, e lei parlerà di sovranità versus autonomia, Stato versus comunità, il dibattito del pensiero politico ebraico. Ora, chi frequenta una delle, non so se sia esattamente un'espressione della fondazione Levi, ma chi frequenta la rivista Una città che esce qui, che corrisponde come persone più o meno alla fondazione Levi, conosce un po', ha avuto un modo di conoscere il dibattito nel mondo ebraico fin dalla fine dell'Ottocento su questa questione, ha avuto il modo di conoscere per esempio il pensiero del partito socialista Bund, che prevedeva un'autonomia culturale, eccetera, eccetera. I ragazzi di città hanno lavorato molto su questo, ho potuto conoscere una persona come Marek Edelman, che era uno degli esponenti del Bund, dei comandanti in seconda dell'insurrezione della rivolta del ghetto di Varsavia, che era un personaggio di culto di una città di cui ne ha parlato molto. E non è un dibattito solo ebraico, è un dibattito come molto spesso accade alle questioni ebraiche accaduto nel XX secolo, un dibattito paradigmatico, perché riguarda appunto il rapporto di cui si è parlato anche prima tra comunità, territorio, lingua, territorio, cittadinanza, lingua, territorio e forme di autonomia di cittadinanza e anche di etnicità o meno degli stati nazionali. Allora la parola Giulia, e in Israele poi è il dibattito in altri termini più importanti in questo momento. Allora la parola a Julie Cooper.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers and to the city of Portland. I'm very excited to be here. I just wanted to explain, I distributed a handout which contains some of the passages that I'm going to be discussing in my talk, and it also has biographical information on the second page about some of the people who I'm going to be talking about that you may not be familiar with. So I'm going to talk about sovereignty, which, as you know, remains one of the most contested political issues of our time. Starting in the 1990s, global transformations, such as unprecedented levels of migration, the rise of non-state actors, human rights regimes, transnational capital flows, and European integration, these phenomena led scholars to debate whether the Westphalian order was on the verge of collapse. In the Westphalian order, the sovereign nation-state was the default mode of political organization and the dominant actor on the international stage. Noting the aforementioned global transformations, many scholars in the 1990s declared that sovereignty was waning, in decline, or even obsolete. This debate turned largely on empirical diagnoses. Have non-state actors replaced states as the decisive political agents? Do states retain control over what transpires within their borders? Will states be eclipsed by supranational bodies like the EU? Yet these empirical diagnoses also prompted questions about sovereignty's legitimacy as a political ideal, leading critics to search for alternatives to the nation-state, for modes of political community that might better accommodate diversity and pluralism. In hindsight, many of the more sweeping proclamations from the 1990s and early 2000s appear premature. After the 2008 financial crisis, sorry, I've been told to slow down. I will try. This is the first time I've been translated. After the 2008 financial crisis, Brexit, Trump, and the rise of ethno-national populism, sovereignty's hold on the political imagination appears more tenacious than scholars predicted. Noting this tenacity is not tantamount to conceding that the contest has been decided in favor of sovereignty. It really indicates the high stakes and complexity of these protracted struggles. Today, foundational political questions are being reopened as citizens and scholars debate whether the sovereign state is the ideal mode of political organization. In today's talk, I hope to convince you that the study of Jewish political history has something essential to contribute to these contemporary debates. Today, Jewish thought is relevant for a wide audience, even people with no independent interest in Jewish topics, because our own political controversies turn on the very questions that have long preoccupied Jews. The question of sovereignty has been inescapable for Jews, given their history of statelessness and dispersion. Indeed, it is not a stretch to say, following Michael Walzer, and here I'm quoting him, that sovereignty is perhaps the central question of Jewish political thought. Just how important is sovereignty, independence, and authoritative direction? In my remarks today, I will focus on one chapter from the long-running Jewish debate about sovereignty's importance. Specifically, I will examine Jewish nationalism in the first half of the 20th century, a period in which the contest between sovereign and non-sovereign regimes took on renewed practical urgency. In the years following World War I, the dire predicament of Eastern European Jews pushed intellectuals and activists to explore a variety of regimes for national autonomy, self-determination, and self-rule. As I will explain, there were multiple camps within Jewish nationalism in this period. Activists who shared a commitment to Jewish self-determination but differed on matters such as the preferred geographical location, Europe versus Palestine, for example, and the preferred political regime, for example, a sovereign nation state versus local autonomy. Although these debates constitute one of the richest nodes of theoretical reflection upon sovereignty within modern political thought, scholars have been slow to recognize their importance, and so I'm trying to rectify that oversight, pay attention to these texts. And today I'm going to give you a glimpse into this chapter within Jewish political history to demonstrate that Jewish thought can yield insights for those wrestling with the challenge of self-determination and minority rights in multi-ethnic communities in the world today, whether in the EU or in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So the main question I'm going to be talking about is whether there is such a thing as politics without sovereignty. That is, in the absence of a state whose authority is singular and supreme. Now, this is the central theoretical question that preoccupied Jewish thinkers in the interwar period. This question emerges again as intellectuals confront the vicissitudes of Jewish political history. Specifically, the fact that for the majority of Jewish history, Jews were a stateless people living dispersed around the globe. In the interwar period, the debate about how to mobilize politically after the loss of traditional bases for Jewish solidarity occasioned a meditation on the Jewish past. Specifically, a meditation on the political implications of exile and dispersion. As activists weighed the potential contribution, or lack thereof, of diasporic practices to the pursuit of national self-determination, they were forced to confront theoretical questions surrounding the definition of the political, what counts as political. As I will show, there is a deep tension running throughout modern Jewish nationalism, a contest between two competing narratives of Jewish political history and two conceptions of the political. On the first narrative, which takes the sovereign state as the paradigmatic political community, diasporic Jewish communities are considered mere religious congregations. Baruch Spinoza offers the canonical articulation of this narrative in his theological political treatise, which was published in the 17th century. On the second narrative, by contrast, diasporic Jewish communities are classified as bona fide political communities, even though they remain subject to external jurisdiction. This narrative achieves prominence in the work of Simon Dubno, a historian and political activist who I will discuss today. In the first part of the talk, I will show how the contrasting historical narratives advanced by Spinoza and Dubno shape the range of available political positions within modern Jewish nationalism. In the second section, I turn to David Ben-Gurion, who is the first Prime Minister of Israel and one of the most consequential figures in modern Jewish politics, whose work exhibits the very tension between state-centered and diasporic conceptions of politics that I'm trying to showcase today. Finally, in conclusion, I will argue that revisiting this historical episode can help us to expand the contemporary political imagination at a moment when it is no longer obvious that the nation-state constitutes the definitive solution to the Jewish question. So, first, I'm going to analyze what I have presented as two competing interpretations of Jewish history that have shaped the political horizons of modern Jewish nationalism, and I'm going to discuss their corresponding conceptions of politics. I'm going to start with Baruch Spinoza and his state-centered model of politics, which is arguably the dominant model in the Western tradition, dating back to thinkers such as Baudin and Hautes. Following Hautes, Spinoza insists that the sovereign state is the only legitimate or viable template for political community. Spinoza's stated goal in his theological political treatise is to defend the freedom to philosophize. To protect philosophers and other unconventional thinkers, Spinoza argues, we must transfer our rights to a sovereign whose power is absolute and whose jurisdiction is ultimate, extending over matters both religious and civil. Now, why did Spinoza exert such a fascination for modern Jewish thinkers in the 20th century? Spinoza's Jewish background and the scandal of his excommunication obviously explain much of his allure, but Spinoza was also a touchstone because he was the first philosopher to explore the political options available to Jews in a world carved up into sovereign states. In the theological political treatise, Spinoza draws out the implications of the sovereignty paradigm for modern Jews. He does so, in part, by offering his own interpretation of Jewish political history. When Spinoza reinterprets the Bible, he offers a resolutely political analysis of ancient Israelite religion, which he depicts as a state religion. Perhaps the most notorious conclusion that Spinoza draws from this depiction of the ancient Hebrew religion as a state religion is that contemporary Jews are under no obligation to observe Jewish law or to identify as Jews. According to Rabbinic Judaism, Jewish law remains binding in exile. On Spinoza's narrative, however, the rabbinic claim that the Israelites' descendants are bound by Jewish law in addition to the civil law of the countries in which they live, that claim makes no sense. If practices such as Sabbath observance and dietary prohibitions were elements of the civic culture of a state which is now defunct, then Jews born after that state's demise have no obligation to uphold these laws and practices. So, for our purposes, so that's a religious claim, but for our purposes, the important issue here is the political rather than the religious issue. What does Spinoza's rejection of obligation to Jewish law reveal about his understanding of the political? As a proponent of state sovereignty, Spinoza must refuse the very notion that legal obligation persists after the state's demise and beyond the state's borders. Thus, the demise of the ancient Hebrew state marks the Jews' exit from politics and history. Jews scattered across the globe do not constitute a unified nation on Spinoza's view, nor do local Jewish communities count as legitimate political communities. Rather, Jewish communities in exile are religious congregations, essentially private voluntary associations. Moreover, this refusal of the political standing to diasporic Jewish communities shapes Spinoza's understanding of the possible avenues for political mobilization in the modern period. For a theorist like Spinoza, who considers sovereignty a sine qua non of politics, there are only two conceivable political options for modern Jews: either individual citizenship in democratic republics or citizenship in a restored Jewish state. In an admittedly reductionist shorthand, Spinoza forces modern Jews to choose between something like liberal individualism or something like state-centered Zionism. Indeed, Spinoza gestures towards both of these possibilities in his theological political treatise. In a famous passage that, as we will see, some have taken as evidence of Zionism before Zionism, Spinoza entertains the possibility that at some point in the future, Jews might establish a modern state. And this is the first passage on the handout. Spinoza writes, "Indeed, if the foundations of their religion did not make their hearts unmanly, I would absolutely believe that someday, given the opportunity, they would set up their state again." Moreover, one can read the entirety of the theological political treatise as an endorsement of something akin to modern liberalism, a political program that centers on democracy, toleration, freedom of expression. In short, Spinoza's commitment to the sovereignty paradigm shapes his political imagination. On the one hand, the state-centered framework allows Spinoza to envision a possibility that was inconceivable for most of his contemporaries, namely the establishment of a modern Jewish state. On the other hand, Spinoza's framework narrows the political options, confronting confronting Jews with a binary choice, either liberalism or state-centered Zionism. So now I'm going to turn to the work of Simon Dubnow, who poses the most forceful and influential Jewish challenge to the sovereignty paradigm in the modern period. In the annals of Jewish nationalism, Dubnow is known as the theorist who insists most emphatically on the political standing of diasporic Jewish communities. Unlike Spinoza, Dubnow classifies the diasporic Jewish community as a bona fide polity, rather than a religious congregation. Dubnow bases this classification on a historical claim regarding the continuity of self-rule throughout Jewish history. In Dubnow's master narrative, Jewish history presents as a continuous, uniform, and successful quest for independence. Surveying the course of Jewish history, Dubnow discerns an indomitable urge to autonomy, to the maintenance of independent social and cultural institutions. Indeed, Dubnow goes so far as to identify the pursuit of autonomy as the motor of Jewish history. From the moment of the destruction of the ancient Hebrew state, Dubnow claims, Jews waged a successful campaign to remain independent. To substantiate this claim, Dubnow lists the communal institutions that enable diasporic Jews to exercise self-rule in every historical period and every geographical locale, and this is the second passage on the handout, in which Dubnow claims that in the diaspora, Jews had, quote, central organs of self-administration, its own legislative institutions, corresponding to the Sanhedrin, the academies and patriarchs of Roman Byzantine Palestine, exilarchs, Geonim, and legislative assemblies in Babylonia, the aljamas and congresses of communal delegates in Spain, Kahals and Naans, or congregation of Kahals in Poland and Lithuania. So, essentially, if Spinoza reserves the category of the political for the imposing organs of state, Dubnow valorizes local institutions and practices. Indeed, in Dubnow's work, the humble Jewish Community Council assumes an outsized role in the maintenance of national identity. Dubnow was an activist as well as a scholar, and we can see a direct relationship between his historical research and his political advocacy. Dubnow is generally aligned with the autonomist camp within diaspora nationalism, a movement that demanded national autonomy and minority rights for Jews in Eastern Europe. If we return to Dubnow's text, we will see that he bases his concrete political prescriptions on his interpretation of Jewish history. Indeed, Dubnow presents his own political program as an updated version of traditional Jewish autonomy. When Jews demand autonomy within multi-ethnic polities, Dubnow contends, they draw on their own political heritage as well as contemporary discourses of minority rights. Here, exile does not mark the Jews' exit from history and politics. Rather, the experience of diaspora yields a distinctive political tradition worthy of continuation in the present. Again, for our purposes, the historical validity of Dubnow's claim is less important than the conception of the political on which it is based. Unlike Spinoza, Dubnow acknowledges the possibility of politics without sovereignty. On Dubnow's analysis, diasporic Jews remain an independent political community, even though they are dispersed and even though they are subject to the laws of the Gentile state. According to Dubnow, one can be autonomous in the strict sense without sovereignty in the strict sense. Thus, where Spinoza only saw two political options for modern Jews, liberalism or Zionism, Dubnow offers a third possibility, namely autonomy or extraterritorial nationality. If one adopts a Dubnovian approach, diaspora does not require that one forfeit national identity, nor is the nation-state the lone regime that supports national self-determination. So I've presented Spinoza and Dubnow as two models, and as two figures who are locked in a debate over the correct interpretation of Jewish history and the proper definition of the political. Yet, as you probably have realized by now, Spinoza and Dubnow lived in different historical periods, and so they didn't actually debate one another. But such a debate did take place indirectly in the text of Jewish nationalists writing in the first half of the 20th century. So now I'm going to turn to the first half of the 20th century and show that for nationalist thinkers such as David Ben-Gurion, Spinoza and Dubnow symbolize two competing approaches to Jewish politics. Moreover, Ben-Gurion felt the need to wrestle with the competing claims that Spinoza and Dubnow advanced, and he adapted insights from both thinkers as he formulated his own political program. Why is it important to showcase this debate? Recovering this history enables us to challenge teleological interpretations that reduce the myriad camps within Jewish nationalism to Zionism, effacing diaspora nationalisms, and reduce Zionism itself to the single-minded pursuit of Jewish sovereignty, effacing autonomous currents within Zionism. After the establishment of the State of Israel, it became commonplace to think of Zionism as a movement founded with the express goal of establishing a sovereign Jewish state. Turning now to the writings of Ben-Gurion, I'm going to try to challenge this view that the turn toward the nation-state was a foregone conclusion. In the first half of the 20th century, at least, it was not immediately obvious that Spinoza was right and Dubno was wrong about the institutional underpinnings of Jewish self-rule. As we'll see, even Ben-Gurion at times felt the pull of a diasporic approach to Jewish politics. Ben-Gurion's attraction to Spinoza is well known. Unsurprisingly, this attraction is often invoked to reinforce the stereotypical view of Zionism as a movement wedded to the sovereign state. Indeed, the concept of sovereignty figures prominently in Ben-Gurion's public statements regarding Spinoza's cultural significance. And now we're on the second part of the handout. And the example I'm going to use is a 1953 column for the Davar newspaper. And in this art column in the Davar newspaper, Ben-Gurion exhorted Israeli scholars to rehabilitate Spinoza and disseminate his work to a wide public audience. In this article, Ben-Gurion appeals to the Jewish public, which is liable to be put off by the admittedly harsh tone that Spinoza adopts as an analyst of Judaism, ancient and modern, by touting Spinoza's Zionist credentials. This is quote number 3. Ben-Gurion writes, Spinoza was also, in a known sense, the first Zionist in the last 300 years. With a clear-eyed historical glance at Jewish and world history, Spinoza prophesied that the state of Israel would be renewed. Now, the question here is, what does it mean to be a Zionist in this essay? Here, Spinoza qualifies as a Zionist because he envisions the possibility of a modern Jewish state. Indeed, the passage from the theological political treatise that Ben-Gurion deems prophetic reflects Spinoza's conviction that, to return to history, Jews must abandon diaspora for a sovereign nation-state. Writing as Spinoza's advocate before an Israeli audience, Ben-Gurion presents Zionism as a Spinozist movement, that is, a movement based on a wholehearted commitment to ideals of sovereignty. What is less well known, however, is that Ben-Gurion also drew theoretical inspiration from Dubno. In other words, Ben-Gurion did hesitate before adopting Spinoza's sovereignty paradigm as the obligatory political template. Indeed, over the course of his life, Ben-Gurion worked out his own political position in dialogue with both figures, Dubno as well as Spinoza. Last, I now turn to Ben-Gurion's 1926 essay, National Autonomy and Neighborly Relations, in which he defends a decentralized regime of local autonomy as the regime best suited to the multi-ethnic composition of Palestine. In this essay, Ben-Gurion responds to Zionist critics who contend that ideals of autonomy have no place in the land of Israel, given their diasporic lineage. Pointing to the unprecedented multiplicity of races, religion, tribes, and cultural outlooks in the land of Israel, Ben-Gurion argues against the establishment of a monolithic, centralized regime. Instead, he argues, Zionists should adapt diasporic traditions of local autonomy to the political exigencies of Palestine. In short, in this text, Ben-Gurion endorses autonomy rather than sovereignty as the regime best suited to advance Zionist political aims. For our purposes, the genealogy that Ben-Gurion provides for the regime capable of accommodating local diversity proves more significant than the concrete details of his proposed scheme. Although Ben-Gurion does not mention Dubno by name in the essay, he offers a near verbatim précis of Dubno's theory of Jewish history, and, more important, invokes this theory to justify his own proposal. As Ben-Gurion acknowledges autonomy as a diasporic Jewish pedigree, and this is the long passage on the handout, Ben-Gurion writes, "From the moment that our political independence in the land of Israel ceased, the Jewish people has never stopped striving to organize its internal affairs in an autonomous fashion. In Babylonia, in the land of Israel after the destruction, in the Western European diaspora, in Turkey and Eastern Europe, the Nasi, the Reish Galuta, the Council of the Four Lands, the Kihila, the village in Turkey, all of these were in different ways and under different conditions in accordance with the historical situation and local conditions, autonomous enterprises of the Jewish settlement in the lands of their dispersion." From Dubno, Ben-Gurion takes the notion that autonomy is the motor of Jewish history, and he even recites Dubno's list of diasporic political institutions. In short, unlike Spinoza, Ben-Gurion is willing to accord political standing to diasporic communities that lack sovereign power. Ben-Gurion cites Dubno in an effort to trace the diaspora of Jewish pedigree for the regime he endorses in Palestine. Although Ben-Gurion is eager to situate himself within a lineage of Jewish political traditions, he nevertheless notes a great difference between his own autonomous aspirations and those of Jews in diaspora. Against activists who would copy diasporic forms and transfer them directly to the land of Israel, Ben-Gurion insists on developing regimes of autonomy that are appropriate to the needs of what he considers a territorial rather than an extraterritorial nation. So what's the difference in Ben-Gurion's view between a territorial and an extraterritorial nation? Ben-Gurion presents Jewish agricultural settlements in the land of Israel as examples of territorial autonomy, and he said because they have broad jurisdiction over issues including land, defense, security, and irrigation. Their jurisdiction is not restricted to religious or spiritual matters. And his central proposal in the essay is that Zionists should build a more comprehensive regime on the foundation of these agricultural initiatives. Now, one could object that the very aspiration to territorial nationality portrays a tacit longing for sovereign power. In other words, it is no accident that Ben-Gurion eventually became a staunch defender of the nation-state, for the nation-state constitutes the inevitable culmination of territorial ambitions. Without downplaying Ben-Gurion's eventual role as the architect of the Jewish state, I would nevertheless emphasize the contingent aspects of this historical trajectory. Indeed, this 1926 essay is significant precisely because it invites us to uncouple territory from sovereignty. Ben-Gurion severs territory from sovereignty toward the end of the essay when he rebuts the arguments of Zionists who would extend Jewish rule over Palestinian majority cities. And this is the last sentence on the handout. Ben-Gurion writes, if anyone thinks that we should cancel the autonomous order of Tel Aviv so that we can rule over Jaffa, a Palestinian city, that is a subversion of our very existence. Here, Ben-Gurion warns against the temptation to forsake autonomy for sovereignty. Ben-Gurion is not tempted because, as a student of Dubno, he understands that it is possible to exercise self-rule without sovereign power. Autonomy, in the strict sense, means self-rule, giving oneself the law. Thus, a proponent of autonomy who has to refrain from giving the law to others, abjuring the centralizing and totalizing pretensions of the sovereign state. Of course, we know that today, Israel rules over Jaffa. That is, the autonomous order was preemptively canceled as a state-centered model of politics took over within Zionism and within Jewish politics more generally. By way of conclusion, I want to say a few words about the potential relevance of the story that I have related. How can this historical chapter illuminate our current predicament at a moment characterized by increasing doubts about Israel's future as a Jewish nation-state on the one hand, and increasingly vocal assertions of sovereignty as a counter to forces of globalization on the other? In the period following World War II, the state-centered model largely captured the Jewish political imagination. Indeed, after the destruction of European Jewry, it became commonplace to say that Dubno's diaspora's vision had been decisively refuted by history. Moreover, since World War II, the vast majority of the world's Jews have lived either in North America or in the state of Israel, under regimes, liberalism and state-centered Zionism, that roughly correspond to Spinoza's two options. In the second half of the 20th century, Jewish political discourse became markedly Spinozist, captivated by an interpretive frame that made liberalism and political Zionism seem like the default political options given modern Jewish history. In this period, diasporic or non-state forms of Jewish politics, forms of politics that were local, transnational, or autonomous, seemed almost inconceivable. Today, however, both of Spinoza's preferred alternatives are in crisis. The collapse of the Oslo process arguably signals the end of the nation-state phase within Zionism, and the rise of ethno-national populism signals a move toward political democracy across the globe. To confine my remarks to the Jewish case, at this juncture, it is no longer obvious that the sovereign state, whether the liberal state or the nation-state, constitutes the definitive solution to the Jewish question. The demise of the Oslo process has inspired a new round of proposals for federal, confederal, and binational solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as increasingly vocal calls to implement what activists on the right term the vision of sovereignty by annexing parts of the West Bank. With the collapse of the two-state solution, questions once thought settled, questions about the imperative these questions have reopened. At a moment when Israelis and Palestinians across the ideological spectrum are beginning to experiment with autonomous and federal solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it no longer seems so obvious that Dubnov was refuted by history. Once forgotten terms like autonomy, are returning to the Jewish political lexicon. In sum, the ideological configurations that have prevailed in Jewish politics since World War II are collapsing before our eyes, but alternative configurations have yet to crystallize. The challenge confronting Jewish thinkers today, I would argue, is to propose alternative theoretical configurations. Efforts to revive possibilities that were foreclosed with the ascendance of the sovereignty paradigm, or at least to restore these far forgotten possibilities to the public conversation, are a key component of this project. I tried to get you to see that claims regarding the supposed obsolescence of diasporic modes of Jewish politics after World War II rest on a particular conceptual framework, one that we have inherited from Spinoza. Moreover, as I have demonstrated, the Spinozist model was not the only model that captivated Jewish nationalists. The Dubnovian model has been equally influential in the history of Jewish nationalism. In short, the question of regime has been contested throughout the history of Jewish nationalism, and it remains contested to this day. With greater historical perspective, we can develop a more powerful rejoinder to those who mistakenly insist that the nation-state constitutes the default interpretation of Jewish political independence. According to Spinoza's contemporary heirs, those who reject exclusive Jewish sovereignty or express reservations about the justice of the nation-state are forced to adopt some variant of liberal individualism, of Judaism as a private Protestant style of religious identity. That is, they must renounce national identity and the aspiration to Jewish self-rule. As Dubnov reminds us, however, liberalism, universalism, and cosmopolitan are not the only alternatives to the nation-state, nor do they provide the lone stance from which to oppose the undemocratic and racist forms of Jewish nationalism that predominate in Israel today. Rather, we can oppose exclusive Jewish sovereignty in the name of an alternative vision of self-determination. To navigate this admittedly perilous political moment, we must find creative ways to resist the nation-state imperative without abandoning aspirations to self-rule. Thank you.
Grazie tante a questa ragione Cube. Ovviamente c'è spazio, se vogliamo, per due domande. In sostanza la questione è anche un po', se posso dire, sulla memoria degli sconfitti, cioè il paradigmatico del pensiero ebraico era paradigmatico il fatto che la visione diasporica dell'autonomia degli ebrei sia stata sconfitta e sia stata distrutta per le camere a gas dei nazisti. E Giulio Cooper ci stava dicendo che in realtà quell'opzione dell'autonomia contro la sovranità come l'unica opzione per la responsabilità degli ebrei, per assicurare un futuro agli ebrei, quel pensiero che sembrava sconfitto è riemerso ed è riemerso con molta forza oggi nello stesso Stato di Israele rispetto al problema della pace e della convivenza con i palestinesi. Niente, se ci sono domande, contestazioni, eccetera, eccetera, la parola a voi. Se non c'è, noi passiamo io avrei tante, ma diventerebbe un dialogo tra due ebrei, non ha senso, di cui sarebbe esclusi. E allora, due ebrei nel senso due persone molto interessate a tanti temi specifici. Allora, io passerei a questo punto la parola al professor Wolfgang Merkel. Wolfgang Merkel è politologo tedesco, attualmente insegna all'Università Humboldt a Berlino e anche lui si è occupato ovviamente molto delle questioni della democrazia, anche un trascorso italiano, nel senso che si è occupato molto del Partito Socialista Italiano e delle sue trasformazioni ai tempi di Berlino crisi, e qui ci parlerà di nuovo Cosmopoliti versus comunitari, la nuova frattura sociale. La parola al professore.
Signore e signori, permettetemi per un momento di scusarmi che non parlerò in su bella lingua, però non vorrei torturarle con la mala mixtura di italiano e spagnolo con un accento teutonico grave. Por eso continuerò in inglese. I will start with a comment to Michel and to the question whether we are living in a crisis of democracy or it is some kind of transformation. My first argument would be we cannot even answer this question because we do not have a good theory of crisis of democracy. We do not have a clear concept of crisis, whether it's an acute crisis, whether it's a permanent crisis, and we do not have indicators which could indicate us when a crisis begins and when a crisis ends. And if we do not have this theory about a threshold which distinguishes a crisis of democracy from normal times, we should be very cautious to use it. Just to finish this point, I would argue, I agree what you said, democracy today is much, much better than democracy in the 1950s and 60s. Think about the United States. Think about the era of Kennedy. In 6 single states, Afro-Americans were not allowed to vote, and they were called at that time niggers. Think about the role of women. If women had the bad fate to be wives, they had passed almost everywhere in Western Europe in the 50s and 60s, whether they are allowed to strike a contract on the labor market. Think about the homosexuals. Think about the minorities. There's one difference when you call the Trente Glorieuses. This means at that time capitalism was a national economy. The democratic state could intervene. And now we are in a globalized, deregulated economy, and the single state is no longer really able to intervene, to interfere along democratic demands from the society. This may be a difference, so I would conclude democracy is much better today than 30 or 40 years ago, but it has become extremely vulnerable. I jump in immediately into my topic, whether there is a new cleavage running through our societies, a cleavage which can be called, this is not an easy thing to do and maybe also problematic, a cleavage between cosmopolitans and communitarians. So my first point is there a new cleavage in Europe and across the Atlantic? The second one is I want to focus this question on one single issue, and this is the issue of borders. The issue of borders as a new dividing line in our societies. And what kind of narrative can we expect from both sides, from communitarians and cosmopolitans related to this question? And then I will have a few remarks what cosmopolitan democracy can mean and where the problems may lay, and then what the communitarians think about democracy. Last but not least, I will end with a question whether a specific sort of communitarians, meaning chauvinist, nationalist communitarians, which we can call right-wing populists, are only bad for our democracy, or do they fulfill a positive function as well? So you see, I led until the end my provocation. Why to talk about a cleavage theory? a dividing line running through our societies. The reason here for my argument is, if there is a cleavage, then those parties who are mobilizing along such a cleavage, they will stay, they will endure. And this is especially important if we are talking about the future of right-wing populism. So this is a reason, and I think if there is a cleavage, the cleavage has to fulfill at least 4 points. There must be some kind of social revolution as a trigger. Secondly, there should be, or we should be able to identify 2 opposite camps in terms of interest and social structure. There should thirdly be a narrative, an ideological underpinning of the position. Do we have such a narrative from the cosmopolitan and communitarian side? And fourth, we have to look whether there are organizations which position themselves along this cleavage and mobilize along such a cleavage. And here I'm thinking about political parties, interest groups, and social movements as well. So, is there a struggle over borders? And I was talking about a social trigger. I consider globalization, which I do not define here, globalization as such a social revolution which can be compared with the Industrial Revolution, which in the end has produced the cleavage between capital and labor. Oppositional camps. There are winners of globalizations, and there are certainly also losers of globalization. And it will be interesting to position cosmopolitans and communitarians in one of these 2 camps. And I do believe there is an ideology, or at least a narrative of both sides, if it comes to the question of borders. If I talk about borders, it means borders in a wide sense. And to put it very simply, I mean, it is important whether one is in favor for open borders or controlling or closing borders. This is a major conflict between the 2 camps. And if I say borders in a wide sense, it means borders open or closed for goods, services, capital, but also for nation-state competencies. Should nation-states be allowed to transfer national competencies into a supranational political space, which may be less democratic than the nation-state space, then at least we may have a dilemma in terms of democratic theory. So it's about competencies as well, and it is especially about people, about workers, about asylum seekers, about refugees. And cosmopolitans, to put it a bit simply, are in favor of open borders, and communitarians have some arguments, and not only normatively problematic arguments, to close borders. There is, I would argue, there is still a left-right cleavage. I think it is wrong to predict or diagnose that this cleavage has disappeared. All the indicators we have to measure, for example, inequality, have increased during the last 3 decades, even in our best democracies and social or welfare states in Scandinavia. So this cleavage still exists, but there's a cross-cutting, dividing line, which I would call a cultural cleavage, which manifests itself in our societies, and this is a cleavage along the question of borders, along the question sense, as Max Weber would have used it, as ideal type. At the end of a continuum, and if you check yourself, you will, and you may be not so sure in which camp, on which question you would position yourself. So who are, or what do the cosmopolitans propose in a normative manner? So I checked 3 different arguments here, a normative one, a social structural one, and an organizational one, as I have pointed out with the cleavage. Normatively, cosmopolitans are focusing on the individual, individualism, universality of rights, and even to some extent of citizenship and generality. So they are in favor, therefore, for open borders. It's not only a question for the nation state, it's a question of all civilized nations that we open borders, we engage in global justice, not only social justice within a nation state. So in an ideal form, the citizen is not only a citizen of the nation state, she or he is especially also a global citizen. Borders. Borders, they argue, are contingent. They are historically contingent and they are constructed. And because they are constructed, they can be deconstructed as well. And this is what it is on the agenda of the political actors. And they are in favor to transform as much as it is required by the transnational problems to transform national sovereignty into supranational institutions. So they are prepared to give up nation-state competencies, be it the European Union, the World Trade Organization, or the International Conference on Climate Change. So if you are a super cosmopolitan, you are a neoliberal on the one side, and you are, so to say, cosmopolitan in cultural terms for open society, for global citizenship. But of course, you can also be in favor of closing borders for certain capital movements, but at the same time open it for refugee and asylum seekers. This is a mixture you will find quite often on the liberal left side of our political continuum. Cosmopolitans are, simply put, the winners of our society. I come back very briefly to this point. Normatively, what can we say about the communitarianism? Of course, this is a broad array of political thinking. We have heard something about some exponents already. This is running from a conservative position of McIntyre to a more liberal communitarian position of Michael Walzer. A core argument goes like this. You need firm borders. You need political communities with an identity. Otherwise, you cannot create interpersonal trust within a society. This is the argument of Putnam and others. And you have to create a sense of belongingness, otherwise you are not willing to redistribute beyond the market. You are not willing to give up your individual meritocratic, maybe meritocratically earned income. So it is important for trust, it is important for solidarity, therefore you need borders. You need borders, and you need loyal communities. If I'm talking about communitarians today on a political scale, we may distinguish between two forms. One is certainly normatively highly problematic. These are the chauvinists and nationalists we find in the political party form of right-wing populists, but you also find a way of communitarians in favor of closing borders in Scandinavia. This is the old social democratic idea of people's home, Volkshemmet, as the Swedes called it at the end of the 1930s and practiced it in the 1950s, 60s, and even 70s. And if you would look to a nation state today which comes close to such a model, I would name Denmark. Denmark is differently from Sweden. They close the borders quite rigidly, and if you read political programs, even of the left, of the Social Democratic Party in Denmark, you have the impression, or I have the impression, that I read the program of the AFD, the German right-wing populist parties, sometimes even with subtle racist subtext. But according to our indicators we have, and according to all rankings we have on the quality of democracy, Denmark is always among the best democratic countries we have on the globe. And in terms of inequality, it's one of those countries where you have the lowest level of socio-economic inequality. As a trend, I would call those communitarians or sympathizers for political communitarianism tend to be on the loser side of globalization. With that, I come to the structural point. Cosmopolitans are typically, and we did a huge research at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin on a book which comes out now with Cambridge University, The Struggle Over Borders, and we did surveys with political elites and mass surveys, and you find the followings. Cosmopolitans have an above average education. They have an above average income. They have high human and cultural capital, and they are highly mobile. They can live in Rome, in Toronto, in Madrid, Berlin, or in some of the other countries. Some of our colleagues from the London School of Economics has called the cosmopolitans the frequent flyers of our society. Communitarians are typically, and this is a statistical average, have typically an under-average education, an under-average income, lower human and cultural capital, and they are less mobile. And saying this, they are less mobile, you find immediately a material interest. They may be interested in firm borders, in a nation state which can act on social matters and don't give it up to supranational market regimes. So the elites, and across the wide array of different elites, the elites are cosmopolitans. And the masses are more communitarian, with the exception of, and this is quite a broad exception, the exception of well-educated urban middle classes. Here you find cosmopolitan values in quite a significant amount. What do they think about democracy? What kind of concept of democracy do they have in mind? Globalization as I argue here, and it's not only my argument, has damaged the autonomy of nation states. And this is what cosmopolitans would argue, and they continue to argue those affected by political decision do not coincide with national borders. So those who are the addressees of political decisions cannot understand themselves as the authors of political decisions. This is one of the major arguments of Hans Kelsen, the constitutionalist, that there must be a coincidence in democracy. And so they argue, therefore we need the cosmopolitans, we need to transcend nation-state democracy, and they have this functionalist argument, problems cannot be solved nationally anymore. There are transnational problems from trade to climate change. We cannot fight on the level of the nation state. We need pooling national sovereignty. We need to give up it to WTO or the climate conference or the UN or other supranational organizations. But they are also saying there should be a shift in legitimacy, and the shift in legitimacy means it shifts from the input, the participatory dimension of democracy, to the problem-solving dimension of output. So they are prepared to give up, and you have to be prepared. If you give up nation-state competencies to a supranational level, then you give up transparency, you give up participation, you give up control, you give up representation, accountability, all the goods we know about in democracy, maybe less. But you could argue, I am prepared because therefore I solve problems. This is the input-output shift of legitimacy. And they believe, and this is the optimistic straight, they believe that these supranational spaces can be democratized. Just in parenthesis, the great political theorist and democratic theorist Robert Dahl argued size matters for democracy. There has been transformation of democracy from the city-state, the ancient city-state, to the territorial state, which was accompanied by loss of democracy, and then we are now at the verge of a new transformation where we have to give up some democratic competencies because we are living in times of globalization. Just one word, I don't run through my whole slide, but I have a slide presentation here. The question with a cosmopolitan democracy is the following. Keep aside for a moment the size problem. How do you decide who is affected by political decision? Then probably all the rest of the world must have the right to vote in US elections. Because those decisions are affecting our fate to quite a large instance. Of course, this is somehow nonsense, but if you think about the congruence argument by Kelsen, this is something which cannot be solved. So the cosmopolitans still insist there should be at least better coincidence of those who decide and those who are the addressees of political decisions. So, and there are externalities, certainly, as economists would argue, of national political decisions. The bigger and more important state is, the more externalities will it produce for other countries. However, from which degree of externality should we intervene? And so I would argue there's a question of practicability. It is over-complex and it is to a large extent non-transparent. And this is one of the critiques I would pose against the European Union. This is a kind of multi-level governance system which only real experts have an idea who participates in the decision. And this is even among political science professors. Many do not actually know where is important in the decision, who is important in the decision for, let's say, environmental issue, educational issue, research and development. This changes to a large extent. So I'm a bit skeptical about this concept of democracy. Communitarians, I was talking about, the idea is this is grassroots if they are not chauvinist nation-state bound or nationalist communitarians. They think about a grassroots democracy, a strong democracy, as Benjamin Barber would have put it, or as Charles Taylor put it, a liberal, communitarian, republican community, which should be the understanding of a communitarian democracy. There are the right to rights, the right to have rights, and this can be best protected in a smaller, closer community. They are opposed to some extent to excessive pluralism, liberalism, and sometimes multiculturalism as well. I jump then to the last point, right-wing populism. And I hesitate a bit to link right-wing populism to this noble tradition of the philosophy of people like Charles Taylor. And this is not what I want to do, but from a conceptual point of view, they are mobilizing along this cleavage across on the question of borders. Before I come to this last point, I just want to say something about, as I have promised, about the organizational manifestations. Do we see organizations mobilizing along an ideal? Typically, you would put on the cosmopolitan side the Greens, especially in Germany, the Greens, or Podemos in Spain. And typically on the communitarian, national communitarian side, right-wing populists, as I have already tried to spell out. And one of the problems center-right and center-left catch-all parties have during the last 2 or 3 decades, social democrats or Christian democrats, they are split on this issue. Especially social democrats are split along this issue because they know they have a clientele which belong to the losers of globalization, and therefore they cannot be super cosmopolitans. Nevertheless, if you look to the elite level of these parties, you find mostly cosmopolitans. If you look to the politicians on a municipal level, you find much more communitarians and traditionalists. So this cleavage runs through parties like the Partito Democratico as well, and it contributes to the decline of those parties, and I consider this as one of the problems of our democracies, that those political integration machines called catch-all parties are no longer really viable in our times because the society has become too differentiated and too heterogeneous. But they are needed even more because the society has become heterogeneous and has become differentiated. Are right-wing populists a threat to democracy? Please remember the typical right-wing populist voter is male, is less educated than the average, has less income on the average. This is what we have found among 15 right-wing populist parties. Are they a threat to democracy? Politically, I would argue it depends. It depends very much whether they are in opposition. And they can push those parties who are in government, those established parties to fill, and we were talking about, to fill a representation gap, which obviously the established parties have left. Otherwise, these right-wing populists, or if you want, left socialists, would not have found the political space to establish there. It is a different thing if those parties enter government. And it is again a different situation if they enter government as a junior partner, as it is the case in Austria, or as senior partner, or even a partner who doesn't, a political party who doesn't need any coalition partner as we have it in Hungary. And there's also a difference whether democracy is well consolidated over decades, or it's less consolidated and comes out of this post-communist transformation we have seen in Eastern Europe. Normatively spoken, they are a threat to democracy. They have programs which are certainly xenophobic and sometimes even racist, even if we had yesterday discussed that it is not that easy to find a common ground what racism finally means. They are doing, among others, the following. They are reframing political conflicts in ethnic and nationalist terms. Even social conflicts, they are redefined in ethnic terms, and this changes the public discourse of our society. This is certainly problematic. However, if you read Chantal Mouffe, Ernesto Laclau, who write about populism, more about leftist populism, and here in parentheses as well, I would argue there is a decisive difference between left and right-wing populism, and the decisive difference is right-wing populism is exclusive. They exclude on ethnic ground the others. And left-wing populism, at least on theory, wants to include the socially marginalized people. They have both in common, they have a certain contempt for intermediary organizations, especially for political parties and sometimes for parliament as well. And Chantal Mouffe, for example, certainly a post-Marxist, post-structuralist, or post-something political theoretician argues they are changing an elitist-driven discourse in our society. This is a Gramscian argument. They are changing the discourse against the elite. So it is an old topic one can bring up, which relates to some extent to a class consciousness coming out of the Marxist tradition. So they are arguing, they're bringing back in political discourse, and what on an empirical side they hint at the fact that we see during the last 5 to 10 years again an increase of electoral participation. This is not only driven by right-wing populists, but it is driven by the countermeasures of a liberal society, civil society, and both contributes to a more intensive discussion. So political apathy is no longer what characterized our democracy. It's a new polarization. It's a new intensive conflict, however, as I have pointed out, or tried to point out on problematic terms. One could argue, not neglecting that political parties have a supply side. They create demand among citizens, but they also follow, obviously, a demand. And one could, in democratic terms, argue, in that respect, right-wing populist parties are responsive in terms of voter demands, but they are irresponsible in terms of a long-term common good. What we will expect for the next time to come, this is my argument, more polarized societies, a trend towards majoritarianism, meaning with 50.1% you can decide. You do not have to take into account what 49.9% want. So the deliberative idea to include as much as possible the people, not only the majority of the people, gets at this time a blow from politicians like Viktor Orban, but Donald Trump as well. So what I expect is there will be an illiberalization of our societies, or at least the high risk. And what right-wing populists are doing, they play, so to say, with the two fundamental dimensions of democracy. They try to play out the dimension of popular sovereignty coming out of the French Revolution and the thinking of the French Revolution against the rule of law dimension, the dimension of individual rights and group rights. And this is the battle we are observing in those countries where right-wing populists are in government and strong. Thank you very much for your attention.
Se ci sono le domande, ancora abbiamo 10 minuti. L'argomento è un po' chi è il sovrano. Alla fine la questione è chi è il sovrano e quali sono le prerogative del sovrano. C'è qui la signora Evanna Novatska e una...
Thank you very much for this very inspirational panel. I don't have questions, I have two comments which I would like to share with you all, inspired by what has been said during the panel. Specifically, I would like to come back to Professor Merkel's first comment he made discussing Professor Wieviorka's statement at some point, which has to do with optimism about the status of democracy now in the world. And I agree with you on being that democracy is not in such a bad state, or it's better than it was in the past, although it's not that easy for myself coming from Poland, when I'm every day observing the destruction of democracy by democratic mechanisms. However, despite that, I think the fact that democracy is doing well has also to do with the societies, with individuals, their awareness about their rights, their claim of their rights. So people now want to have more and more rights, and they want more. And so I would say that empowerment of people is a positive side, although certainly it creates a lot of dangers. I think that can be a bit similar to medicine. You've never in the past, in the history of humankind, we didn't have better medicine than it is now. But I think that we've never in the history experienced such a criticism towards medicine, and taking into account that people are aware what medicine is about what our rights to health care. So in a way, I think that mutatis mutandis is a bit something which is similar to democracy and perception of democracy by people. And so that leads me to another comment of Professor Wieviorka's statement, where you were telling about the further development of democracy, which I share very much with you, because when you look what is democracy for the societies in the first place, for people in general, this is, going to elections every 4 or 5 years. But what about the democracy in between? So the concept of this as an institutionalized conflict, which is certainly a very good idea, but it should have form not as a possibility, but as a must. So I think the further step for development of democracy is to find mechanisms how people democratic right to democracy could be experienced between elections time. Thank you.
Grazie tante, non so se qualcuno vuole rispondere o ancora dire qualcosa, perché poi abbiamo fatto molto da professore. Yes, please.
Just a brief response to the comment. I do agree, or even I have to confess, we overstress the empowerment of the people. If this is true, empowerment in a democratic sense, how would you explain that you have such a dramatic majority of voters who are voting for Viktor Orban and his policies? I don't believe in this kind of modernization theory. We are just becoming more and more emancipated. History is not such a Foucaultian, Hegelian thing where everything goes up. And the problematic and interesting thing is, what are we doing if we, the so-called experts on democracy, are clearly saying what happens in Hungary is a decline of the quality of democracy. And the same if we are saying in the 1990s for Italy under Berlusconi, that we talk about today. What you see is the following. The people are in favor, and they were more and more satisfied with democracy during the 1990s in Italy. Look at the Eurobarometer data, and there are more and more, at least more people satisfied with the Hungarian democracy. Though the people, the demos, may have an undemocratic consciousness as well. And the experts say at the same moment, and we checked it by our own indicators, of course, there was a decline of quality of democracy under Berlusconi, and you can observe it in Hungary as well. So the subjective dimension, what the people think about their democracy, and the objective examination of the quality of democracy can diverge. And these are the problematic situations. Who is the subject of democracy? Can the demos decide it? Or has the demos be strictly limited by rule of law and other regulation? And this is what we are confronted with in these times.
I would like to answer your comment by a very, very general statement, not precise. my position, some people would not agree with this, but my position would be that we are entering a new era. We are a new era. Of course, we don't enter in all countries with the same changes, the same rhythm, but we are entering a new era, which means that we are also finishing with the previous era. And my general idea is that this moment we pass, for instance, from industrial societies to, let us call them, post-industrial societies, from the era of nation states to the era when nation states have to deal with globalization, and so on and so on. In this moment, our political systems, after all, are not able to pass like they were. And this is maybe what we are living, and to say a little bit differently, in this moment of transformation, or I say mutation, metamorphosis, in this moment, maybe what happens is that the old promises of more democracy, more welfare, they don't work anymore, not as they did, and there is a kind of rejection. Because we did not discuss something which is for me very important. There is today almost no left in the world. I exaggerate a little bit, but we don't have any more strong left. They are defeated. And for me, this has something to do with, and I finish with this, the loss of sense, the loss of meaning, and maybe the kind of defeat of universalism. And maybe the problem is what can be universalism tomorrow? What can be the idea that there is some future? What can be new, not a new life, but a new ideas that can produce new parties on the left? These are for me the main issues, but we must not forget that there is no more political left strong. I was reading something about I don't know if it was in Ireland or in Iceland, maybe the president that will be elected is somebody on the left who is a strong popular.
In Portugal.
In Portugal, what we have is a very, very strange mixture, a joint venture between a center-right president and a communist party. But because these people are clever, I would agree with you, but it's a very strange situation. But at the world level, can you tell me where we are strong left able to propose a future, propose meaning?
Greece.
Greece.
Grecia.